Aibuan, Vanakkam, Assalamu alaikum, and of course, a very, very good evening as we welcome you to this, the fourth episode in our awesome series of one-on-one conversations with trailblazing entrepreneurs. The AmCham Sri Lanka Trailblazer 101 series brought to you in collaboration with Kingslake Sri Lanka and the LMD Business Magazine. As you will recall, the AmCham Sri Lanka Trailblazer series is created and curated to provide you with the opportunity of the benefit of the experience, insights, key learnings, and mentorship of the men and women who got it done, trailblazers across the business sphere in Sri Lanka. Today, I consider it an absolute privilege to host on the AmCham Sri Lanka platform a trailblazer a tad bit different from the ones you got used to seeing on this program. Today's trailblazer blazed a trail in an era and an industry different to what we've been hearing in the past few episodes. Holding qualifications from King's College London as a civil engineer, a doctorate in mechanical engineering, and being a teacher of applied mathematics at the University College London, our visionary trailblazer is a proud product of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia. He left Sri Lanka in 1975 and is probably one of the few to return and invest during the height of the Civil War, when he launched his company Kingslake in 1995. Kingslake, or Manankulam in Tamil, and yes, we'll get to that in a little bit, was established in 1995 during a time when technology was still scary stuff. And today, as you are aware, it provides mission-critical systems to a large number of manufacturing, distribution, and logistics companies in Sri Lanka and across the ASEAN region. Entrepreneur, ideator, inspiration, and trailblazer, Dr. S. Dharmavasan. Good evening and welcome to the AmCham Sri Lanka platform.
Thank you, Rai. Great to be here. I don't know where you found all that information from. That's the problem with the digital world, isn't it? You leave a trail of stuff behind and you don't know who picks it up. Absolutely.
The whole purpose of digitization, I guess, benefits and negatives. Well, now I have my own list of questions, of course, for Dr. Dharma, as he's known, some of which, of course, were shared by our audience as well. But if you who's watching here today would like to share any more specific questions, please feel free to type them up into the Q&A box, not into the chat box. And of course, we'll take them up, time permitting. Dr. Dharma, Aibowan, and welcome. Let me start by asking you to briefly introduce us to your childhood. What was your childhood like? What would you say are the experiences that shaped your destiny, as it were? What was it like growing up in a completely different era and environment than what we see around us today? Share with us a little bit of those thoughts.
Well, it was a different world, right? It was 50 or 60 years ago, right, that we're talking about. It was a great time, very happy childhood. And as you said, I was at St. Thomas's, went to school in Colombo, but our family was, so we were in Colombo during school days, but we went over to the East Coast where my parents had the property there. So we went and our holidays were spent over there. As you can imagine, the East Coast at that time was paradise. But growing up, so that's how it started. But as we grew, as we were getting a bit older, I felt the changes that were happening through my parents, because they were a little bit, they were worried about what was happening. They were landowners, so that was the time of land reform and all that sort of stuff happened. And from my father, who was a planter, and then he went into the agrochemical business and so on as a way of earning money at the end of the day. So in a way, it was, so what I saw was that life could change quite rapidly, and you should never take what you had for granted. I went off to England, as you said, in 1975. And that was, again, that was quite interesting. But from a childhood perspective, it was a happy time. But on the other hand, what I learned from that time was you need to be prepared for changes. So that's what I took on board, and to be flexible.
Absolutely. I think those are key learnings. And I mean, it's really important, especially when we look around us right now. It's different day on day. It's not just, a case of eras or decades, or each day is different from the last. And I think especially now with the pandemic and the pandemic environment, we're learning more and more to be grateful for what we have, and of course, to be prepared for anything that life is about to throw at us, I guess.
Exactly. It's one of those things, right? Because at the moment, life is extremely volatile. But on the other hand, don't forget Sri Lanka during the war and so on, things were very uncertain as well. So one of the things that and that was interesting actually, because I set up I came back in '95, and we worked with a number of businesses, and it was interesting how they coped with all that uncertainty and made the best of it. So we can all learn from that. And one thing is for sure, tomorrow is going to be very, very uncertain. I think there's going to be a lot of changes.
So based on what you were just saying about the uncertainty even during those times, and what you see, when you came back here in 1995 and stuff, what made you decide to actually move into technology, especially maybe to come back here to establish a company in tech here in Sri Lanka? What kind of drew you to doing something like that? How did you identify maybe the niche market, and what made you decide?
I was not so logical, right? It was a series of events. So I started, I did engineering. I'm an engineer, first and foremost. And when I graduated as a civil engineer from UCL, by the way, not King's College. So King's College is...
I see, okay. My apologies, yes.
No problem. The industry that was booming at that time was the offshore oil industry, because in the 1972, I think there was the oil crisis and so on, and North Sea had oil, and the UK was beginning to develop those oil fields. And so what started off then was a whole series of technology developments. And when you say tech, as an engineer, you go into technology, whether it's buildings or whatever. And here, it was definitely everything from first principles, because it hadn't been done before. All the previous oil rigs had been in shallow water in the Gulf of Mexico, and whereas the North Sea was much, much deeper. So the platforms were in 200, 300 meters of water. And so these were and very, very harsh environment, very cold and so on. So that whole technology was being developed. And I went back. So I went into the oil industry. I started working for a company that did testing and so on. And so even the first project as a fresh graduate, you ended up having to do something that nobody had done before. So we did some tests, and so that was great. And then I went back to UCL to do my PhD, and my research was in metal fatigue at that time. But if you're an engineer at that time, if you're trying to do the analysis and things like that, you get into computing. You have to use, or that's how I got into it anyway. And during that time, as a PhD student, I was a research assistant at that time, so I had to do some experiments. And before I went, my previous, the seniors, the first 6 months, they would spend writing a computer program to simulate the North Sea conditions, run the tests, and then collect the data and so on. So when I saw this, and so what struck me at that time was, why couldn't we just make that, generalize that program? So I did that. And then the second thing that I did was my colleagues had developed, and my PhD supervisor, they had found a way to not only to find cracks, but also to measure them. So that was a sensor which was invented at UCL. And so they had patents on that. So what I did was to then find a way how to actually connect it to the computer, because that was also not possible at that time. So this was 1979, 1980. And so we did that, and that worked. So which meant I could run the experiments 24 hours a day. And so I was able to collect 3 times as much data, which is fantastic. So I had a very good thesis and so on. But the thing that was interesting was people going through the labs and so on wanted to buy the software, and the university wanted to commercialize. This was a time Mrs. Thatcher had come into power. Universities had cuts to funding, so we had to find money. So this was one way that the university wanted us to get money into the university. So they encouraged us to set up a company and commercialize the research. So we were still on the staff, but we were able to, we were able to also work part of the time employing other people to develop the stuff further. And the royalties went back to the university, and we also had research projects and so on. So that's how that worked. So that company, so the software that we had, or that I developed, then went on to being licensed by a large, there were two large test manufacturers. One of them licensed it, they sold it around the world, and 4 years down the line, then they bought the software outright. But the sensor itself then went on to being developed for non-contacting and so on. So that again developed much further. And so we went on to do a lot more equipment to be designed and so on. And at that time, late 80s, I was coming to Sri Lanka, and because of various things that happened in my parents' situation. So I realized that there was a talented pool of engineers coming out. And so we set up a small development unit to do some backend software development for the equipment. And so this was at BMICH, I think it was in 1991. So that's how I set it up. And these guys did fantastic programs and so on. And that stuff is sold around the world, and it's used by most of the oil companies and so on, not just the oil companies, but also anywhere where cracks are found. So that's how I got into working a little bit in Sri Lanka. So that was 91. But the gang there then said, look, why aren't we selling into Sri Lanka, you know? So then how can you sell stuff that is relevant for the oil and gas industry in Sri Lanka? And also, even though the engineers were very, very good, there was a gap because they were working in isolation. So they were dependent on the specifications and the requirements and things like that coming from their colleagues in the UK. So what they said was, why don't you set something up here so then we also understand what is going on? So I discussed it with a few of my colleagues and friends and so on. And then we said, okay, let's do that. But I was not, because I was still in the UK, my main thing was my research programs. I was a member of staff and things like that. So we then said, okay, let's buy or acquire a company that was in the Sri Lankan market, and then supply stuff into the Sri Lankan market and see how we can actually grow into that space. And we chose manufacturing because at least that was a little bit more technical than anything else that I could do in Sri Lanka. So at that time, this must have been early 90s, a number of the blue chips at that time had got into software, and then they found it difficult and they were getting out. So so we looked at a few, and in the end we purchased something from John Keel's. It was JK Software. They had a what would seem strange now was a PC-based accounting package, which had, and for us, what was interesting was that was actually being used by a number of manufacturing companies. And so we could see how we could go into those companies and then see how we can actually add a lot more functionality. So we bought that with their staff, and that's how Kingslake came into being in Sri Lanka. And Dulip Fernando, who is a CEO now, came in at that time, not from John Keel, but he was somewhere else, so we recruited him. And Janaka, who was in development, is still there. So that team is still there. So that's how it got started. So there wasn't a particular plan and a niche and things like that. It was a sequence of events.
Sequence of events that kind of got, took off because of being in the right time at the right place, maybe.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay. So the story of, well, not the story of Kingslake, but the story of the name Kingslake. I read an interview where you had given an explanation, and I thought that was very warm and sentimental. Would you like to share that with us?
Yeah, Kingslake, the name comes from Manankulam, which is the coconut estate that I grew up on the East Coast. In the, I think it was 1985 or 86, the house that we grew up in and things like that was all burnt down during one of these conflicts. So for me, that had gone, but it had great sentimental, so a lot of memories. So when we started the company, we called it Kingslake, because that was a way for that name, for it to actually continue in the so-called virtual space. But so that's how that came into me.
Oh, that's a beautiful, and I think something.
But by the way, Manakulam is still there. Eh? So now
yes,
I'm
yes.
in the process. I'll tell you about another story later on. Maybe I can talk about it, because there are lots of other things I'm doing with it at the moment.
Oh, lovely. That's of course very important. That like I was saying, the fact that you were probably one of the few to come back during that time to invest in a company, to invest in Sri Lanka, and also to kind of connect it to your roots, I think is a huge thing. I think maybe that's one of the reasons that organizations have that grounding, that foundation creates part of why you are such a success and why that trailblazing happens, because that grounding and believing in your roots is always something that's important. Any thoughts you can share on that?
Yeah, because also when I came in '95, I came on a 2 year. It wasn't a sabbatical; it was a 2 year leave of absence. But again, lots of things happened unexpectedly, and so on. So I got married in '95, and so we came back originally for 2 years, and then when these things happened, then we decided to stay on. And the roots, I think, is important, because our commitment, or my commitment, was how are we going to make a difference in Sri Lanka, and working with the manufacturing companies and so on was that. So we were focused on the manufacturing industry and putting in the systems and so on. At that time, all the systems in place were essentially accounting systems with a little bit of inventory control. And if anybody wanted a manufacturing system, then they would have had to bring in people from outside and so on. So my thing was, first of all, build capacity. So I took fresh graduates, and we took them on board, built them up. So so the capacity was built up, but also working with the manufacturing industry. So these are the people who are real pioneers in manufacturing, who were really built on growing that business, becoming a success globally, and so on. And so that was also good. And for me, success was, if the way I saw success was not if we grew or we made huge profits or whatever. For me, the success was, how did they do? Did we contribute to their success? And that was important for us. And for us, from a point of view of building up that Sri Lankan industry, especially during that war situation, was important.
I can understand that, and absolutely. I mean, those are some of the things that we've missed along the way. So it's wonderful that we had someone like you come in and actually pick that up and do that. I think that's a huge thing. Dr. Dharma, can you tell us, you've kind of given me a background to the organization, how it was set up, what kind of created that spark. What would you say is the secret, or what is the story of your corporate success, of your organization success? 25 years down the line, you're established as a star player among the manufacturing and training sector. What would you say is the story to that?
I think this goes back to my engineering roots and being specialized, right? It's focus or specialize in something. Work in that one particular niche and get to know it as much as you can. Right. And stay ahead of, and just continuously keep learning and learning and learning, so that you can then share that knowledge with the people that you're trying to serve. So it's as simple as that, right?
So, what would you say? Maybe the three most critical factors in turning what is an idea into a successful product or service. Like you said, one would obviously be that learning and improving as much as possible.
Okay.
But what?
So in my case, I have we did the software, which then went on to be being used by all some of the world's largest laboratories in the world. There has to be a need, right? So the first is you need to identify that particular need or a niche. So you need to be able to solve a particular problem, in my view. There are others who say that let's build something and tell people that they have to
create
use
the need
after
that.
So in my case, I've always felt there has to be a need. It has to be and concentrate on building a solution for that, whether it's a service, whether it's a product, or whatever it is in that particular niche. But you need to be capable of doing it. You can dream about it, but at the end of the day, you need to have the capability. If you don't have all the capability, then you need to work with a team that can execute on that.
Right.
You need to build something, right? So that's the second thing. The third thing, so the second one is also a big, what I mean is the capability. If you don't have it, you also need to have a team. So you probably need the right team with you. And the third one is, of course, at the end of the day, it takes money. And it may be your own money, it may be your spare time, whatever it is. And the early years is tough. And so you need to somehow or the other sustain yourself. And from a small company perspective, what makes you get into trouble or go bust is not that you have a huge order, so that could be, you may have large orders, but if you can't if you don't have the cash to get through that a period of time, it's tough. And in those days, the large companies are the worst in paying.
Yes.
The smaller guys would pay you.
No, I don't think it's just in those days. I think in these days too.
So you need to manage your cash flow, and you need to be careful with the cash. So those are the three, I think. So you need to have an idea, you need to have a team, and you need to manage your money.
Organizational success habits. What would you say are your personal success habits, and what would you say are the organizational success habits that you created that have brought Kingslake to where it is today?
My habits, I'm not sure, because basically I'm I'm an enthusiast. I read a lot, and whatever it is, I absorb quite a lot of information and then try to process it to see what could be useful. The second thing is I prioritize quite quickly. I do prioritize very quickly to see what needs attention, and I respond to that. From an organizational point of view, when we set up Kingslake, at that time, and also don't forget we had actually acquired this company from John Keel. At that time, a number of companies would only hire people from my ex-school, for example.
The old boy network.
Exactly. But at Kingslake, I felt merit was important. I didn't care whether they went to my old school or whether they were men or women or whatever, it didn't matter. So right up to now, we only hire on merit. I never influence, or I never come with a CV and say, oh, this is my friend's, whatever. And similarly, they can put their CVs in, but it goes through a process. So, and everything is done on merit. And internally also, the way we do have the appraisals and all that sort of stuff, but it's in a way done much more in an informal way, but although there's a formal thing. It's the fact that we work on merit makes a huge difference. The second thing was we do not have any politics. So whenever something like that happens, it's nipped in the bud straight away. And again, the reason for that is I believe that, we hired a number of fresh graduates, and some of them are still with us in senior as part of the management team and so on. So those values have been built up over many, many years. So everybody knows that it's fair and so on and so forth. and everybody's in it together. And the third thing is we do not, we are compliant in the sense we will not do things which, we don't take shortcuts to do business. So so those are the three.
Great. So I'm gonna repeat that to make sure I got them all down. So in terms of your personal creed or your personal success habits, definitely learning, reading, and getting more information as much as you can, prioritizing,
Yes.
and then of course implementation of what you learned. In terms of the organization, it's a meritocracy, and that's important.
Yeah. No politics, exactly.
And compliance. I think these are, amazing.
They're basics, but you'll be surprised how many organizations don't do it. And recently, we are in the last, at the end of the year, we'd ask people what are the things they like about Kingslake. And one of the things that came out, and because there was this Me Too movement and all this sort of stuff, so it was interesting. So, for instance, it was one of the places. So a lot of our female employees said that was one of the most female-friendly places to work.
I think that's something that's very important, because I guess something that we keep saying, if your workplace and in the environment that you're working in is such that you are comfortable, you're confident, and you're able to bring your A game, then at the end of the day, it's both the organization and you that will continue to succeed, because they are satisfied with what you're bringing to the table. You feel like coming to work in the morning, and I think that's all super important. Great, brilliant. So, okay, moving on to our next question. If you could travel back in time to when you started the organization, what advice would you give to yourself on that?
Right. I will. It's a good one actually, because the first company that I had, I started in 1984 at the university. So I was 27 years old, and two of my partners, one was my PhD supervisor, and the other one was another colleague of mine. So he was into robotics. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1998. But there were three of us, and when the company was at a certain level where it had to go outside and employ lots more staff and so on, another friend of mine, we were doing our PhD together, he came on board. So he ran it full time, whereas we were still at the university. So we were allowed to spend 1 day a week. But at the end of the day, we had to be there for certain things. So we couldn't, so even if we went on holiday or something like that, if there was a particular problem, it would only be, I would be the only person who could solve one. Something else would be Bill Dover, who was my PhD supervisor, and something like that. So that was, so when I set up Kingslake, I said, look, I think it needs to be more than one person. And right from the start, I set it up and wanted to make sure that it could run without me. Right. So, and to do that, you need to trust people. You need to be able to delegate. You need to be able to get the right people, and they need to trust you, right? I was in Sri Lanka till 2010. 2010, I moved back to Europe. And from 94, 95, when I came back, so we've had several people who had grown with the company and so on. So they're in senior, so the management team there now for the last 10 years they've been running it. I hardly get involved, and now in the last 3 or 4 years, I'm totally non-executive. So essentially, my role is more to mentor more than anything else. So that was a lesson I learned from that first starter, to make sure that you have a team that can actually run without you, if necessary, and eventually run without you and take over from you. So that was one. And the second one is be careful with money. So we never, ever overextend. But all the finance people probably say we are crazy. But on the other hand, we have lived through 25 years. We've never ever had to lay off staff. We've never ever had to, get into great difficulties of not paying our bills. So that's the second one. So you live within your means.
Right, absolutely. And I have to exceedingly agree with you on the first one, because otherwise the level of burnout in trying to do things all yourself and having to constantly be on the ball, it's just too much. I think that's maybe why a lot of entrepreneurships and a lot of startups do end up failing, because you try to, you pump in all your energy, all your finance, all your everything, and then you just can't sustain it. Absolutely. Excellent advice to your younger self, which it seems you've already taken as well. So that's very.
Well, I have taken it, and I'm very lucky with my management team, I must say.
So I was going to ask you, what advice would you give? Actually, I am. So the business environment today, right, is completely different from what it was when you started up. It's a lot different today than it was a year ago. In fact, it's a lot different than, 2 years ago, we saw a big change. And then, right now, even from on a day-to-day basis, we see a lot of things. How did you and your team navigate through this? And what sort of advice would you give someone in the same space in terms of navigating and kind of sustaining, being strong, hanging on, and, tomorrow, the silver lining, as it were?
Okay, the first thing is business has changed in the way it operates and the way you do deals and all that sort of stuff have changed. But one fundamental thing has not changed, and that is anybody who does business with you has to trust you, and you have to trust them. So that remains the same. But the way you communicate, the way you get across the information, that has changed. So, for instance, even before the pandemic started, we have customers in several parts of the world, and we actually deal with them remotely and all that sort of stuff. So that has changed. But on the other hand, with the pandemic, and I believe post-pandemic, there are going to be a lot of changes as well in terms of the way the business is going to happen. For example, we have Japanese customers. In the past, I would have to, if it was a large contract or whatever, I would have to physically go there, sit. We would have to, first go out drinking and whatever it
Several
is.
rounds of negotiation.
And eat and drink and things like that. And 3 days later, when you had to sign this piece of paper, and it was a huge ceremony. But now, last year, one of the most conservative companies, it's a large one, and they then wrote to us and said, look, can we do it electronically? Overnight, changed. So that's going to happen, and I believe it's better for the environment, better for all of us if we can continue a lot of the remote stuff wherever possible. But you do need to meet people face to face for certain things, and that is still necessary. And unfortunately, at the moment, it is difficult. But the business of digital marketing, the way the whole digital influencing and things like that work, has changed quite a bit, and in some ways not for the better. What it means is sometimes not the right things come on top. However, the people buying from you are also much more educated. They know, they have done their homework, and so they know what they're looking at buying and so on. So I could sit here and say, look, I'm the best, but they would have done their homework to find out, are these guys really good and so on. So that is good, and that's good for companies like us where we are solid and we do our homework, we do our work and so on. So in a way, it's that digital presence is important, and if you can't handle that digital presence and the digital marketing and the communications, then that does put you at a disadvantage. But on the other hand, if you can do it well, the whole world is your market, right?
So one thing that you were saying was about building trust, and the fact that at the end of the day, the most fundamental thing that hasn't changed and won't change is that to do any sort of transaction, you need to trust each other. Now, for an organization like Kingslake, which has built a reputation as being trustworthy and competent service provider, as you said, out there using digital medium and marketing and kind of spreading that news. What sort of advice would you give to maybe a startup that doesn't have the opportunities that you or we had in the past to build face-to-face relationships, to build networks? Any suggestions, any ideas that you could give in terms of a mentorship?
Now, I think you need to be clear what you can do, and
Not
be very,
overpromise.
and much more importantly, be very clear about what you can't do. And also, and this was one of the things that we had, one of our early customers. And again, I'm not going to name the company, but the entrepreneur who had started it, and they're a global brand and all that. But he asked me, "Can you do this in?" Dulip and I were there on one Poya day, where we had this typewritten sheet with all his requirements. So we said we can do that. But then he said, "Can you do it in 1 month?" We said, "No way." So it's a process. So again, and also be very clear about the capability you have and what you can do and what you can't do. And if you're a startup, sometimes you are put under pressure to do all sorts of things. And again, it's good to know what you can do and what you can't do, and be very, very specific about and be very clear about saying no.
So I'm actually, in my mind, I'm kind of jotting down specific words that you've used throughout this interview that we had, because I think I'm going to have to find some way of highlighting them. I'm playing in my mind with how I'm going to do this, but I will bring that up. Switching gears in terms of conversation, what would you say keeps you up at night?
I said I worked for the oil and gas industry in the 70s. That's a bad word now. But the IPCC report came out a week or two ago. I think climate change is here. And if we continue at the rate we go, we have, we have serious problems. So that's, and the thing is, you can see it, at the moment, I think we are at 1.1 degrees above. And with that, there were floods in Germany, floods in China, floods, forest fires, this, that, and the other. And even in Sri Lanka, the weather patterns have changed. So that's one. I think we need to think about how what we can do. And also from a software point of view, we are working with manufacturers, right? And manufacturing is difficult. Making things is difficult. It's dirty. It's whatever. So we are thinking about what sort of things can we do from a technology perspective to help our customers to get to help with that in terms of climate change. And the second thing that also worries me is the amount of disparity that's happening. The wealth disparity, which is at a level which I think 30 or 40 years ago it wasn't there. So those two things. But climate change is for all of us. Right? Just because we are in Sri Lanka doesn't mean we're going to be okay, and somebody else is not going to be okay. So that's something that we've all got to take on board, and we have to start thinking about how we can do things differently.
I guess in a way, the pandemic has maybe sort of highlighted this a little more, because we're realizing, how much we can do without the things that we thought we couldn't do without, things that would really affect the environment. We're learning that, all of it is not as essential as we thought it was before. Sure. We are able to breathe better, and we have better environment, better air quality. And I think all those things are also teaching us. And also, like you mentioned, I mean, every day there's news of either a forest fire somewhere or a flood somewhere, and I honestly, I have to say this, I wake up each morning, and as I say my prayers every morning, I just look out my window and I think how blessed we are to call this island paradise our home. Despite the fact that, like you said, the weather patterns have changed, the monsoon is no more how it used to be. It's, there's all of that as well. And it would be so brutal if we were to actually murder this environment and lose it before our kids and our grandkids have the opportunity to enjoy it. So definitely, I think that's something we all must take on board. And I'm glad that you brought it up as something that's, so key and so important. So thank you for that.
No issues.
So, Dr. Dharma, I mean, you were born and you grew up in an era that's very, very different to what we experience. An era that you could call simpler, cleaner, less complicated, less convoluted in every way, whether it's, social, economic, all of those factors. And over the years, you've had the opportunity to learn so much from what we would consider as contemporary history, whether it's the civil war and the unrest in Sri Lanka, whether it's, ethnic conflict and those things, the pandemic, previous instances of, various global issues and fallouts. What can you share with us in terms of a life lesson or life lessons that you would like to pass on to the generation now that's trying to build, trying to learn, trying to make their mark, as it were? What lessons would you share from everything that you've seen and you've experienced?
For me, live for the moment. Live the now, not what has been and what it could be.
Absolutely. Oh, so true, so true. Because you
don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? And in my life, I think I've had so many things that which I never thought would have happened. And you have to pick yourself up and move on. And the thing is, if you didn't live for the day, you would have missed out some of those things.
Absolutely. I think those are beautiful and very valuable words of wisdom for us to actually conclude formally on. Thank you so much for everything you've shared with us. As I was saying, I was running through in my head the various words: continuous learning, prioritizing, integrity, meritocracy. What else can I?
Teamwork. I don't know.
There you go. Living for the here and the now, not overextending yourself, managing, as best as you should. And like you said, being able to say yes and no, and knowing what is the yes and no, and building trust among your customers. Thank you so much, Dr. Dharmavasan, for everything.
Thank you, Rai. It's been great.
It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you on the AmCham platform. And of course, to all our participants on Zoom, our viewers on YouTube and on Facebook, thank you for your participation as well. A reminder, as always, to subscribe, click the alert button, and of course, share the YouTube video, which is what will assist us to continue bringing this very diverse and immediately impactful online resources to you free of charge. As we conclude, a reminder from Dr. Dharmavasan, the team at Kingslake, the AmCham team, and myself. Let's continue to keep our physical distance, masks on, hand sanitized, immunity boosted, fingers crossed, and of course, everybody, good night and God bless.
Thank you.